Billy Graham contemplated suicide in 1974. Treachery had slashed too deeply. Faith was insufficient for the very first time. His secrecy extended beyond that, though. At the airport, he failed to recognize his 2-year-old child and failed to attend the birth of his first daughter. Billy continued to preach even while his son was arrested for drug charges. Furthermore, 40% of his followers abandoned ship after recordings of his true remarks about certain groups became public knowledge. The Billy Graham tale that was kept from you by those in power. During the height of the Spanish flu epidemic that claimed the lives of more than 500 Zalozan Americans, Billy Graham came into this world on November 7, 1918. His North Carolina dairy farm was the setting for his birth, a modest white farmhouse. Frank, who was a devout Presbyterian and governed the household like a camp, rarely exhibited affection for his son. Mararo, his mother, was a devout Christian who recited passages from the Bible at every meal, even breakfast. Fresh veggies, eggs, and milk were always available to Billy as he was growing up. He had to feed 2 horses and gather eggs from 200 chickens before he even knew what it meant to rest, and that was when he was a little boy. They communicated through the language of hard labor on the farm. A gang of federal officers stormed into the house one morning in 1924 when Billy was barely 6 years old. They wanted to find illicit alcoholic beverages. Behind the barn, Billy's dad had been clandestinely running a moonshine still, producing and selling whiskey to keep the family afloat. Shotguns blazing, the agents ran riot through the house, hurling furniture around and cursing at everyone. Frank was taken into custody and Billy was subjected to observe his mother's sobs. The fine was so high that it almost bankrupted the family. Worst of all, the local newspaper carried an article about Frank. An indelible mark was made that day. Alcoholism and a lack of faith in authority would remain crippling fears of Billy's life. Billy had grown somewhat difficult by the time he reached the age of 9. Because of his untamed antics, his brothers dubbed him Billy the Kid. At a religious gathering, he once made a neighbor's cat go through people's legs by tying explosives to it. He would use a rubber band to hurl spitballs at people's expensive feathered headwear during Sunday services. The preacher's wife was previously struck by him as well. His parents sent him to the doctor because he was hyperactive, and the doctor recommended additional physical work and castor oil to calm him down. It was all for naught. Something occurred that year that Billy will never forget. He held his dying grandma, whom he affectionately called Mama, as she collapsed after a stroke. She smiled, opened her eyes, and claimed to see Jesus and her long, dead husband Ben as she was about to pass away. While fighting in the Civil War, Ben amputated both his legs and suffered a severed eye. However, Mama said that he appeared to be in good health as he stood by Jesus' side and extended his hand to her. Billy beheld the tranquil expression on her face as she slipped away. He was deeply unsettled by the moment. It gave him a taste of heaven, but also instilled in him a lifelong fear of dying. Billy was 11 years old and the family farm was about to go bankrupt when the stock market collapsed in 1929. The family needed everyone's help when the price of milk suddenly decreased. Billy milked 50 cows by hand twice daily. Hours later, his hands were stiff and aching. Afterwards, he would carry milk bottles and transport them across town, occasionally traveling more than 10 miles each day. Not everyone paid with cash. Alternately, they might offer veggies or poultry. Just enough money came in for him to keep the farm running. Nevertheless, he discovered the importance of perseverance in the face of adversity. Going to a revival led by a preacher called Moriah Ham in 1934 altered Billy's life forever. He was 15 years old at the time. He planned to make fun of the gathering when he went. However, the preacher pointed directly at him and warned him of hell one night. He was struck like a bolt of lightning by it. Despite his best efforts, the words remained. He was so frightened that night that he walked the 2 miles home in the pouring rain. For 8 months, he kept quiet about his decision. Strangely enough, his mom took note. Instead of cursing, he began to study the Bible daily. A permanent shift had occurred. Despite his passion of baseball, Billy was far from a model student. At Sharon High School, he was a first baseman who once hit a grand slam that ended a game in front of 2,000 spectators. On the other hand, he sucked in class. It showed in his grades. It was common for him to pull pranks. He once pretended to be deaf and used sign language for a whole lesson to trick a substitute educator. The school's bell tower was his hiding place for everyone's textbooks. The year he was a senior, he had to redo. and with that, his aspirations of playing baseball disappeared. Bob Jones University followed. It was more like a jail than a university when Billy enrolled in 1936. Endless rules were laid out. There was no way to shake hands with someone of the opposing sex. Chapel was at 6 in the morning, and lights out was at 9 in the evening. Peer observation was to be carried out by the class. Billy despised it. His public shaming for inquiring about the permissibility of listening to classical music and his nighttime sneakouts both got him in trouble. He was informed by the founder, Bob Jones Sr., that he would never achieve success as a preacher. Billy departed after only 1 semester, claiming that the institution had the power to erode his faith. Billy sold fuller brushes by knocking on doors in 1937 while he was a student at Florida Bible Institute. He encountered a gang of inebriated males who threatened to physically assault him at some point. Quick on his feet, he fumbled in his pocket, pretended to brandish a weapon, and fooled them into leaving him alone. A hairbrush indeed, but it served its purpose. He was able to cover his college expenses that summer by selling more brushes than anyone else. The most valuable thing he took away was the ability to communicate with others and command respect from even the most hostile audiences. Billy and Ruth Bell's tragic love tale started in 1941 and nearly ended in tragedy. The devout Presbyterian missionaries forbade their daughter Ruth from dating. Still, Billy's heart sank the second he laid eyes on her. Pretending to be prayer companions, they secretly went on picnics, exchanged notes, and went for long walks. Her father almost had her expelled from school when he discovered one of Billy's letters stashed in her Bible. Ruth went back to Tibet as a missionary and confessed years later that she had intended to remain single. Billy, nevertheless, never let up. He persuaded her that their union was divinely intended. Billy became a member of Youth for Christ in 1943. Soldier Field in Chicago was the site of his debut major performance. Not even half of the 2,000 men he had anticipated turned up. Using the allure of coffee and pastries, he frantically raced across the city, enticing soldiers from pubs. It was already packed when he began to preach. He talked for just 12 minutes due to his anxiety, yet it had the desired effect. His voice came to him that night, urgent, fervent, and hard to disregard. Ironically, he later confessed that he joined YFC solely to evade military conscription. Billy initially traveled around Europe in 1947. He arrived in London donning a verdant suit and ostentatious footwear. A Technicolor preacher was his moniker in British newspapers. As a result, demonstrations ensued. People in one city hurled eggs at him. There being no other suitable platform, he preached while standing on a makeshift stage constructed from coffins in Paris. His zany moves and stunts had people talking, but they were effective. He became popular all around the world and made a fortune of 250 $250,000 on the trip. Following reports of other preachers being subjected to blackmail by means of hidden cameras and prostitutes, Billy and his associates drafted a stringent code known as the Modesto Manifesto in 1948. Ever since that fateful day, he would never ever ride an elevator alone with a lady who wasn't his wife. In fact, before he entered the hotel, his crew made sure that no one was hiding. There was a situation where it saved him, but it sounded extreme. He discovered a woman intending to extort him lurking in his closet with a camera. Her arrest occurred prior to any events taking place. A little church in Western Springs was pastored by Billy from 1943 until 1948. Just 48 per week was barely enough for him to get by. Compassionate churchgoers provided vegetables, while Ruth baked bread from scratch. When it came to Sunday services, Billy could only borrow suits since he didn't possess a good one. In church, Ruth's shoes, which were only kept together by rubber bands, once broke apart. Even selling larger brushes again was Billy's last resort for making ends meet. He left his job after the church declined to give him a $10 raise. A few short months after that, his new calling as a traveling preacher took off. Literally overnight, his weekly income increased from $48 to $500. Billy stood up in Augusta, Georgia in December of 1948. Upon seeing the ropes dividing the white and black attendees, he ripped them down with his own hands. He had been scheduled to preach in a segregated setting. There was a threat from the Ku Klux Klan. Despite the governor's warnings, Billy remained unwavering. Unheard of in Georgia at the time, he enlisted the services of black police officers for protection and asked a black preacher to share the platform with him. In fact, nothing like this had transpired since the 1800s. Under a circus tent at the corner of Washington and Hill in Los Angeles, everything began on September 25, 1949. Billy Graham's 3-week sermon schedule was abruptly altered when newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst sent 2 mysterious messages to Puff Graham, one of his editors. The media went into a frenzy after that one telegram. News articles began to appear in publications across. The tent was becoming about more than simply a religious gathering. It was incredible to see. Night after night, mobster Mickey Cohen would show up and sit in the front row. FBI agents began to take pictures of the assembled people. Money came pouring in. It was pointless to stick to the initial $25,000 budget. Every night the attendance doubled, going from 6,000 to 12,000. For 8 weeks, 350,000 individuals showed up. Los Angeles had never witnessed such a massive religious assembly. Billy, however, was breaking down behind the scenes. After once embracing the Bible at face value, his buddy Charles Templeton became a skeptic and accused him of intellectual dishonesty. That was a blow. At a little after 2 in the morning on October 20th, Billy ventured out into the San Bernardino Mountains by himself, uncertain of anything other than a Bible. At a stump called Surrender Oak, he halted. In the dead of night, he slipped open the Bible and said, "I cannot prove certain things. I cannot answer some of Templeton's questions, but I accept this book by faith." And then, a release came over him. 3,000 people answered his message the night after he sent it. It was 3 times the norm. A change had occurred. Next, November 6th arrived. That next night, Hollywood star Jane Russell, who had a film that had been banned due to its controversial content, came to the front and committed her life to Christ. Stories went viral. Following her was Stuart Hamlin, a hard-drinking cowboy singer who was also a heavy gambler and a horse breeder. Following his conversation with Billy backstage, Hamlin gave up alcohol, sold all of his horses, and began preaching the gospel on his nationally broadcast radio program. He was heard by 5 million people. Not everyone was pleased with the country music hit, "It Is No Secret What God Can Do," which was inspired by one of his broadcasts. Reports of imminent danger began to flood in. At the thought that Cohen might change his faith, mob members were enraged. Near the tent one night, a blazing cross emerged. To keep an eye on Billy at all times, the FBI sent agents. 100 to 150 individuals were baptized at daybreak on December 18th, the last day of the crusade, in the frigid Pacific Ocean. After discovering a homemade explosive device behind the pulpit, the police nearly canceled the ceremony. It failed to detonate due to faulty wiring. The service continued nevertheless. The tent was protected by 300 police officers, the biggest contingent ever sent out for a Los Angeles religious gathering. Billy officially made it official on January 25, 1950. From a cramped office above a Minneapolis restaurant, he established the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. With a fixed salary of $15,000 per year in mind, he informed his employees they could do the same. No monetary donations, no tokens of affection. No one would have access to the funds, since they would all go to an external board of merchants. In just 6 months, 10,000 letters were arriving every week. A monthly total of 100 Zalzard is donated. It transformed the way contemporary ministries functioned. Things reached a nuclear level in London 3 years later. In 1953, Haringey Arena was inundated with 2 million people over the course of 12 weeks. To transport Billy to Buckingham Palace, the Queen dispatched her private plane. Royalty parties were extended by Graham to chimney sweeps and dock workers. Despite the elitists' disgust, the number of attendants from working-class areas increased dramatically. Teachery bomb threats were reported by people sympathizing with the IRA. Each night, 200 undercover officers were dispatched by Scotland Yard. The BBC had to air more shows. An aspiring Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a 19-year-old student at Cambridge, was Billy's interpreter. Billy found himself in New York City by 1957, confronted with demands to divide the audience inside Madison Square Garden. No, he declined. The time was 2:30 in the morning. He personally took down the ropes before opening night and proclaimed, "Christ died for all races." 61,000 individuals testified during that campaign, but the FBI has since accused him of being a civil rights agitator. J. Edgar Hoover mandated constant monitoring. There was a 2.3 million support withdrawal threat from the Southern Baptist Convention. In a stealthy appearance on August 15th, Martin Luther King Jr. occupied a seat that had previously been designated for whites. More money than any religious event has ever made had been paid to NBC to air it. Wrigley Field, Billy's lifelong dream, came true in 1960. Over the course of 8 nights, the attendance reached 1.1 million. After 98 trades, nobody stayed. People from 7 other states were hauled in by the 12,000 cops and 47 chartered buses dispatched by the Chicago police. Thought it was a Cubs game, one guy thought as he stepped in. Persisted throughout the entire sermon while snacking on peanuts and beer. Billy hit a home run when he spoke about paradise. Even the critics found it funny. Youth participation skyrocketed. They were able to collect 847,000. 0.1 was Billy's take-home salary. In 1966, Billy found himself confronted with the Cold War tensions within Berlin's Olympic Stadium. There were 75,000 attendees every night. He had studied German lines the previous night. The authorities in East Germany attempted to block the radio signals. Stacy detained 847 individuals simply for listening. Graham proclaimed the Bible to be more powerful than the Berlin Wall while holding it aloft. Pravda carried Khrushchev's response. Following the emergence of credible threats, the mayor of West Berlin assigned Billy a 24-hour security detail. Carried in Volkswagen Beetles were 12,000 decision cards that were smuggled over the border. Next was Vietnam. Billy preached to 15,000 soldiers aboard a plane that landed in Saigon on March 20, 1966. He publicly framed it as a struggle against communism without religion. Even though he recognized it was a bad idea by 1967, he went nevertheless since Nixon had asked him to. The CIA allegedly handed him $50,000 to use for morale-boosting initiatives, according to later FBI records. He was silent throughout. He voiced characters in propaganda films and confessed in 1995, "I counseled old boys who died the next day, and I never told them the war was wrong." The night prior to the bombing in Cambodia, he prayed with Nixon, according to his journal. His unmistakable closeness to presidents became apparent by 1970. Truman never invited him back after he prayed so forcefully with him in a pistachio green suit at the White House. Billy also proposed that Eisenhower be baptized in 1953. In order to get evangelical support, he persuaded Ike to do it publicly during a golf game. That was successful. It went too far as well. In 1968, using ministry funds, Billy purchased 1,000 newspaper ads endorsing Nixon, following the same strategy. He then admitted that it was an error. He recommended that the United States bomb the dikes in North Vietnam in a spooky letter he wrote to Nixon in 1969. According to Nixon, 1 million innocent people will perish. Everyone could tell that Billy knew, but he still gave his approval. In 1989, when the document first came to light, no one took any action. Billy remained unmoved once Watergate came to light. He phoned Nixon on April 30, 1973, following his first major speech, and he proclaimed it to be among the best speeches ever. He said in secret that he wanted to slit the throats of journalists who dared to criticize the president. The scandal, in his view, was a communist ploy. Until he heard the tapes, he had complete faith in Nixon's intentions during their 18 dinners together in 1972. His sobbing and vomiting continued for 3 days. The next year, his ministry saw a 2.8 million decline in donations. Tapes continued to trickle in 1972. Nixon was informed by Graham that the media was controlled by Jews. A synagogue of Satan, he dubbed them. Everything he had said regarding religious tolerance crumbled when the tapes were released in 2002. In 1979, he addressed 48,000 Sydney residents by comparing homosexuality to murder. 8 years after protesters interrupted 3 services, he hugged AIDS patients as they died in a San Francisco hospital. It was deemed a betrayal by some Christians. Grace, according to some. Also in that year, he turned down a 100 million speaking engagement in segregated South Africa because he wanted to make sure that his audience was diverse. Soul had 3.2 million listeners to Graham's sermons in 1988. All told, 1.1 million people showed up that night. In the background, he was crumbling. He informed his assistant that his long-standing worries about biblical literalism had him haunted, that he had dropped 15 pounds, and that he required air in between sermons. To the throng, though, he continued to preach certainty. In Frankfurt in 1992, he was shaky from untreated Parkinson's. He freely acknowledged that his worst mistake was endorsing Pat Robertson. Because of his decision, he lost 4.2 million and 150,000 followers. On German television, he made the comment that he should have taken a page out of Nixon's playbook. In November 1951, Billy Graham's radio program, The Hour of Decision, began broadcasting from Atlanta, beginning his ascent to the living rooms of Americans. In just 3 short years, it went from 0 to 120 stations, reaching 20 million listeners per week, making it the most widely heard religious broadcast in the world. This victory, however, was not without its price. Even though he preached for 12 hours straight between sermons, Graham taped more than 100 broadcasts annually while leading crusades. While preaching in Florida in 1945, he missed the birth of his daughter She. He found out about her arrival 3 days later through telegram. Anne, his 2-year-old daughter, was a complete stranger to him when he returned from a 6-month crusade in Europe in 1949. In retrospect, Ruth said he was absent for about 3/4 of their children's first 5 years. While his worldwide quest took flight, his children were left to fend for themselves. Television further disseminated his ideas by 1957. For its 16 weeks, the New York Crusade had the highest religious television audience ever, 96 million people. By 1960, Graham's media empire was raking in $10 million a year from radio, books, and broadcasts in 42 different nations. But his family was on the brink of ruin during this time. In Montreux, Ruth was raising 5 children solo and dealing with every emergency that came her way while Billy was away. Ruth frantically sent him a telegram during his 12-week crusade in London in 1954. "Return home. No one needs your sermons more than we do." She came clean about considering a divorce twice later on. "I felt wedded to a man whose existence was confined to the pages of newspapers. They stopped calling him Dad and started calling him the preacher man." His impact on a global scale increased, yet he felt increasingly disconnected from his domestic life. With 1.5 million copies sold in 6 months and 2 million in royalties, Graham became the best-selling Christian author of the decade in 1970 with his book, How to Be Born Again. However, domestic crises clashed with achievements. Intoxicated driving and marijuana possession led to the arrest of his son Franklin, who was 18 years old at the time. Graham sent Franklin to rehab and kept speaking about it instead of leading crusades to fix it. He came clean at a 1972 news conference about how little he knew his son Franklin and how little time they had spent together since Franklin turned 13. His response, as Ruth disclosed, was to just pray and preach more. He had severed ties with his own children, the most obvious indication that his powerful ministry had cost him their bond. In the midst of the Cold War, Graham met with Mikhail Gorbachev for 45 minutes and spoke to 50,000 Russians at the Moscow Peace Conference in 1986. His impact extended even to the Soviet Union. More than 25 nations had branches established by 1980, and his organization had trained more than 5,000 counselors. Graham was unaffected in 1987 when televangelists Jim Burr and Jimmy Swaggart were demolished by scandals. He declined $500,000 in speaking fees every year and had set a wage cap of $50,000 since 1952. Playboy offered him $2 million to an interview in 1984, but he turned down the offer, stating that money couldn't purchase his message. At a period when many religious groups were crumbling under the weight of corruption, his financial transparency set the standard. Graham, who was 75 years old at the time, rallied 10,000 evangelists from 185 nations for the 1993 Congress in Amsterdam, a 2-year-long, $15 million extravaganza, the biggest of its kind ever. However, he passed out due to fluid in his lungs while preaching on July 15th. He refused medical assistance and completed his 45-minute speech, despite hardly being able to breathe. In retrospect, he seemed to realize he ought to have passed away while performing. His body bore the marks of his mission's toll. He stated in an interview from 1993 that he would have traded every spared soul to have been present for his family's milestones, including Ruth's 50th birthday in 1970, his children's graduations, and other holidays. For decades, Ruth was technically a widow, according to her journal entries. The universe belonged to Billy before us. At Flushing Meadows, his last New York crusade in 2000, 230,000 people were in attendance. Despite this, Graham, who was fighting Parkinson's disease, gave sermons while seated in a wheelchair, his once booming voice quivering. Recounting his personal friendship with Nixon, he admitted in an interview from 1997 that he regretted becoming involved politically and said, "I crossed the line. I wouldn't do it now." Secret White House tapes exposed political planning meetings and private endorsements. 60% fewer people were there than when he was at his peak in 1957. Graham told friends and associates that he felt like a political pawn a lot during Nixon's administration, and by that point, Franklin had taken over operations. The damaging publication of Nixon-era tapes in 2002 was a major setback. Graham asserted that Jews had a stranglehold on the media and blamed them for pornography in a 1972 talk. There was an immediate reaction. In under 6 months, he went on 2 public apologies, met with Holocaust survivors at synagogues, and gave $100,000 to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. With the hiring of Dr. Gerald Ostrov, the organization established its first Jewish liaison. Donations dropped by $2.3 million, and 40% of evangelical backers distanced themselves. His apology was welcomed by certain Jewish leaders. His meticulously constructed reputation was irreparably tarnished when others proclaimed it too late. Preaching before an audience of 80,000 during his last crusade in June 2005, Graham discussed the hereafter and the prospect of an eternal reunion. However, Ruth passed away from ALS-related pneumonia 2 years later. Billy spent her last days lamenting the many milestones and anniversaries she had missed during the years. Throughout Billy's more than 300 days of annual travel, Ruth had been raising their 5 children solo for 63 years. Graham was away preaching in Romania in 1995 when his wife Ruth was diagnosed with cancer. Ruth wrote in her diary, "I'd rather have Billy part-time than anyone else full-time," but also confessed to feeling abandoned during family crisis. Graham also missed his children's first steps, graduations, and even cancer. He was unable to complete his eulogy at her funeral because he sobbed during it. Although Graham's backing of Mitt Romney in 2012 caused controversy, his My Hope America project had 50 million viewers by 2010. His website had listed Mormonism as a cult for decades, but he withdrew the description after seeing Romney in person. More than half of evangelical clergy members felt it was a betrayal. Employees were concerned about his mental health, according to leaked emails. Graham acknowledged in an interview from 2011 that he felt manipulated by politicians for 40 years, and that Watergate almost shattered his faith in political leaders. Calling his involvement in politics his Achilles heel, he confided in his family that he deeply regretted doing so. Nearing Home, Graham's last book, came out in 2013 and surprised many with its revelation. After 6 months of questioning the Bible's veracity, he almost gave up on ministry in 1949, shocked by the Christian abandonment of friend Charles Templeton. He made a solemn vow to believe the Bible during a Forest Home conference. He had already preached to 215 million souls in 185 different nations by that point. Still, in the midst of taping what he thought would be his last lecture, he failed to attend Ruth and David's 70th wedding anniversary. She had a severe case of dementia and could no longer identify him. "Success in ministry cost me success as a husband and father," he said. Donations totaling 280,000 copies were made to Samaritan's Purse. 4 sitting U.S. presidents attended the funeral of Billy Graham, the most ever for a religious leader, after his death at 99 years of age on February 21, 2018. He bequeathed his ministry 95% of his $25 million estate, according to his testament. He had declined book and television deals worth millions of dollars, so he might escape the controversies that had brought down previous televangelists. In sharp contrast to pastors who made millions, his compensation of $200,000 was substantial. 1 million innocent people could have been killed when tapes showing him urging Nixon to strike North Vietnamese dikes were released in 1972 rocked his legacy. The advice was seen by experts to be equivalent to crimes against humanity. According to Franklin, his father's son, it was his biggest regret. It showed the shadow side of a man who was supposed to be a role model. Regardless of 417 crusades, 3.2 million conversions, and encounters with 13 presidents, deep suffering befell Graham's family. His 3 children who were married had public issues, such as drug misuse, arrests, and unsuccessful marriages. As they were growing up, he was away from home for about 200 days a year, which he acknowledged in 1997 as making him a bad parent and spouse. Depression was a struggle for Ruth as she raised 5 children mostly on her own. One of his guiding documents, the Modesto Manifesto, even served as an inspiration for Mike Pence's contentious dining decree. Even though they constitute 60% of congregations, women still only hold 20% of leadership positions in evangelical circles. Detractors claimed this practice prevented them from advancing in the church. Built with an initial budget of $27 million, the Billy Graham Library currently welcomes more than 200,000 people annually to see his legacy and preservation. In 1974, however, following Nixon's treachery, Graham fell into a profound depression and contemplated ending his life by overdosing. He was only able to be redirected by fervent prayer and scripture. For decades, the moment remained buried, revealing the silent struggle of America's most revered evangelist. As his life came to a close, it was a tapestry of profound human fragility and unparalleled spiritual impact.